Hi, I'm Ed Merrison, and I'd like to welcome you to this alternative format edition of the Vininspo podcast. This alt format series is designed to be interesting, so don't go anywhere. It merely differs from the regular programme in that the slant here is more explicitly informative, and it is, as always, supported by extensive show notes plus visual materials in the accompanying Substack posts. My guests are engaging, inspiring people with a great story to tell, but you might say I'm milking them for their expertise to put you in the picture of the what, where, how, and why of their work. And I, for one, appreciate the fact that they're clear, compelling communicators. My guest this week is no different. Sophie Christmann works alongside her father, VDP President Steffen, at the Christmann estate in Gimmeldingen in the Pfalz in Germany. Initially known for its sensational Riesling from Premier Cru and Grand Cru rated vineyards, Ersten and Großen Lagen in German, the estate has moved into Germany's Premier League of Pinot Noir, or Spätburgunder, in the past decade, with Sophie spearheading extraordinary progress. And as if that wasn't enough, in 2019 a fortuitous sequence of events saw them pair up with Mathieu Kaufmann, a champagne guru and long-serving Bollinger chef de cave, to start a Sektgut, a fully committed traditional method sparkling estate, to take German fizz to the level of top grower champagne. Sophie spoke in detail about this hugely ambitious Christmann et Kaufmann project, as well as the Riesling and Pinot programs, while providing a thorough overview of Germany's Pfalz region, its conditions, traditions and trends. I started by asking Sophie where she was at right now.
I'm in the south of Germany, so right in the middle between Frankfurt and Strasbourg, so also quite close to the French border, in a wine region called Pfalz, which is mostly known for its great Rieslings.
Very good. And what's the weather like at the moment?
It's quite sunny. It's been very hot, but it's chilled down a little bit. Something that we are very thankful for.
Okay, first of all, just tell us a little bit about the Christmann estate, where you sit in the current generation, but also the winery itself and its previous generations.
So my family runs a very classic family estate in the region here. I'm the 8th generation working here. I'm running the winery together with my father since 2017. We've been 2 generations working alongside each other, which is working nicely, luckily. And our winery has a quite long history here in the region. So we know the family's been making wine since the 1500s, but the winery was only founded in 1789.
Before that, you were a mixed farm or only grapes or selling grapes?
Before that, we were also working the land, but we didn't own it. Because only when we became part of France, when Napoleon came over to German territory, the people who owned the land before fled over the Rhine River. And so the people here in the area were able to buy the land that they had been working on for generations. And so many wineries started around that time, roughly.
Well, tell us a little bit about the vineyards where you are and the villages in which they are situated.
I think it's a region that looks quite gentle. So we have the Palatine Forest in our back, which is, we call it the mountains, but it's, I would mostly describe it as hills, but it's a very big forest area that is the biggest forest area in Europe because it connects to the Vogesen in France. The vineyards slope down from the forest to the Rhine Valley. So it's a very gentle hills. It's not as steep and dramatic as the Mosel, for example, but it's a very nice area. It's also quite warm. It's one of the most southern wine growing areas in Germany. It's sometimes called the German Tuscany.
Yeah, and the Pfalz is in a typical year second in level of production of wine to Rheinhessen. I think it sometimes goes to and fro between the two.
Yeah, exactly. Germany has roughly 100,000 hectares of vineyards, and roughly 25% are in Pfalz and 25% are in Rheinhessen, which is a bit more northern than Pfalz. And those are the biggest wine growing areas. I think they are quite different in structure because Pfalz has a bit longer history in small family estates, I'd say.
Yes, and within the Pfalz, you're situated in Gimmeldingen, where you are at the moment, in the Mittelhaardt, so the middle section, effectively, of the area. For many people, maybe the part of the Pfalz that has the most famous villages, perhaps, for wine growing. Could you just tell us a little bit about how you would describe the different parts of the Pfalz, those things that the region on the whole has in common when it comes to wine growing conditions, and those things that maybe mark out the different sections?
So, we divide the Pfalz in 3 regions. In the northern part, the Mittelhaardt area in its core, and the southern part of Pfalz. The core region, the Mittelhart area, is just, as you say, the one that has the longest history for high quality winemaking, which I'd say is mostly due to its climate that is a bit warmer. Because the forest that I was talking about, in our area, the forest is quite close, so there are not many valleys, so it protects us quite well from wind, which makes our area a little bit warmer. In the northern and in the southern part of Pfalz, the forest is a bit more disrupted by big valleys. And so there's lots of wind, and so it's quite a bit colder. So sometimes it's funny for people to explain that the southern part of Pfalz is more southern, but it's the coolest part of Pfalz. So it makes almost 10 to 14 days in ripeness difference between the Mittelhart region and the southern part of Pfalz, which is only a 15-kilometer drive. So it's a quite small area. Apart from that, the Mittelhart region, where our winery is in, or in general, maybe Pfalz, is also known for very diverse soils. So we don't have like all those classic soil layers that are very structured, but soils are very different here in different vineyards, because when the Rhine Valley crashed down millions of years ago, all soils got mixed up. And that's something that makes Pfalz very interesting, because many vineyards have different little isles of different soils.
You obviously have a history of the Burgundian varieties in Pfalz, with Riesling obviously being a large proportion of the vineyard as well. Roughly, how do you see the vineyard mosaic, the split between different grape varieties across the Pfalz region?
So I think, like, of course, Riesling is our main identity. And right after Riesling, as you say, it's the Pinot varieties. We have a very long history for Pinot Noir, because the Pinot Noir wines, they arrived to Germany through the monks from Burgundy that founded a daughter abbey, firstly in Rheingau. And already a year after the Kloster Eberbach was founded in Rheingau, they founded another daughter abbey in the Palatine Forest. And so they actually farmed the edict. So we know that the Pinot wines must have arrived in Königsbach roughly 800 years ago already. We also have quite a bit of history for Pinot Blanc. Chardonnay is actually quite new. It's getting more and more important, but Chardonnay was only planted in the Pfalz region from the 90s. So it doesn't have such a long history. And apart from those high quality varieties, there are, of course, also some varieties that are a little bit lower in quality, I'd say. It also make up a bigger part of the Pfalz region, because, as we said, it's a quite big region. And so the structure of the wineries is also quite diverse.
Yeah, you have a lot on your plate, and we'll be discussing a lot of it with Riesling, Pinot Noir, and also the sparkling wine. And I'm assuming that Chardonnay's become a little bit more important in the picture for the sparkling program for you. What about still Chardonnay? Is that something that is just a step too far with everything else that you've got going on?
It's something that we discuss sometimes, because there was a planting of Chardonnay in the edict when my father was able to lease the vineyard in the 90s, but he chose to replace it with Riesling. And so we haven't had any Chardonnay since. And I think we as a family, we have a very strict belief in limiting our work to the things that we really love and that we really believe in. And I think a winery needs some focus to achieve really good quality. And even though sometimes I'd also be interested to make a Chardonnay and to see how it turns out, I believe that we have a great focus with Riesling and Pinot Noir, two varieties that we really love. And there are so many great German Chardonnays that we don't necessarily need to make it ourselves.
That's a fair point. Okay, well, let's start with Riesling then and dig a bit deeper there. You did a harvest, I'm pretty sure, when you were a bit younger. I mean, you're still very young, but when you're younger in Australia, probably other places too. Where did you work in Australia, and what do you remember from that time? What did you pick up as lessons from this climate?
So I went to Grosset to work with Steph and Jeff in 2016. And I think that's maybe the place where most of the German winemakers, German and Austrian winemakers' children get sent to. So there were quite a few people before me, and it was a great experience. I think I mainly applied to go there because of course very often people ask us how climate change affects Riesling and if it will be possible to grow Riesling under warmer conditions. And so I was very interested to see how great Riesling grows under very warm conditions. And I think this was my main motivation, but I learned a lot. So it was a very cool experience.
Now, we've had Ernie Lowson on the podcast. We've spoke to Philip Wittmann and Cornelius Dernhoff as well. So we dug into, I suppose, the generalizations that we tend to deal with when we're looking at the Mosel, the Nahe, and the Rheinhessen, and also those things that make it much more interesting and more specific. So I'd like to do that with you as well for Pfalz. And perhaps it's a question, as you said, of the Mittelhaardt being separated from the other parts of the Pfalz in terms of the generalizations, but of course digging right into your vineyards because that's where the real excitement happens. You make a wine called Aus den Lagen, which is an expression of your vineyards as a whole, I suppose your part of the world. What would you say if people have a rough idea of what they might get from a Rheingau wine or a Rheinhessen wine, a Nahe wine, a Mosel wine? What do you think they can imagine being typical of a Pfalz Riesling?
I think a Pfalz Riesling, to me, it's always a bit more generous. Since it's a little bit warmer in climate, usually there's a little bit more fruit expression. So usually our wines have a bit more of those apricot flavors, I'd say. I think very often the wines remind me of the landscape that you see. And I think the wines, for example, from Mosel and Nahe, they are often a bit more dramatic. While the wines from Pfalz are a bit softer, maybe a little bit more pleasant to understand and a bit more gentle. So one of the main takeaways that I had when I went to also visit some restaurants in Australia, everyone said, I really like those wines from Pfalz because they are always a little bit more generous. There's a bit more going on. Maybe the wines are not as lean as they are from other regions. And I think that's the main description of Pfalz for me. And we always joke it's a little bit like the people.
So once we go past that rough idea of what Pfalz looks like, give us an idea of the different vineyards that you farm and what you see as being their particular strengths when it comes to producing a Riesling.
So as we said, our winery is situated in the Mittelhaardt region. In general, the Mittelhaardt region shapes around the villages of Forst, Deidesheim and Ruppertsberg. Names that people might know when they know Great German Riesling. Those villages are the historic center of Mittelhaardt. They are characterized by sandstone soil. So the wines are always a little bit louder in their fruit expression. We don't have many vineyards in that area because our winery is a little bit further away, a little bit closer to the forest, a bit higher in elevation in a village called Gimmelding. And the area around Gimmelding where our vineyards are is mainly characterized by tertiary limestone soil. So it's a limestone blended in a little bit of loam and clay, so a soil that is actually quite similar to Burgundy. And the vineyards are a little bit higher in elevation and closer to the forest, and therefore a bit cooler and a bit more wet than the very historic center of the Mittelhaardt region. I think that mainly characterizes our estate, and so we also chose to focus our vineyards slowly even more in that region because it's just our home.
Yes, which I think is quite interesting. You don't generally see that many parcels being, I suppose, swapped around or estates rearranged in the sphere that you work in. But Christmann has been very active in selecting those parcels and making a few tweaks with neighbours to make sure that what you've got in the portfolio is exactly what suits you. Given what we've said about the generalisations that one might make about the Pfalz and about the Mittelhaardt, what generalisations might one make about Christmann Riesling?
It's always a hard question. I'd say our wines are a very classy interpretation of Pfalz. If you look at winemaking in our area historically in the last 40 years, 50 years, maybe in the 70s and 80s, the grapes didn't get ripe every year because it was simply too cool. Something that we can't imagine now. That was the reality back then. And then up from the 2000s mostly, the grapes got ripe every year. And at some point, people here in the region, also we in the winery, we had to learn that grapes can get overripe. It's something that we didn't know in Germany before. And so we had to really learn to pick in the right moment. And I think that's something that defines our wines, mostly because they are never too heavy, never too loud, but we also don't want them to be too lean. So a Christmann Riesling is a wine that is always fresh and elegant. It's not too loud in fruit expression. I think in general, like Pfalz might be a bit more fruity than our style, mostly also because our soils are a bit more limestoney and not as sandstony. So in general, I'd say it's a Riesling that has a nice structure, a good freshness, soft fruit, but lots of saltiness and length.
Yes, I think that's very fair. I think, as you say, generally that false element, I suppose, is in the ripe fruit and perhaps that stone fruit character that you kind of move into, not without some of the more citric elements as well. Certain herbal elements and a bit of spice. But as you say, that sort of chalky and salty kind of line, I know that we're not really allowed to say that it comes from the limestone, but you can't help but feel that there's some kind of correlation there because it does remind you of other wines that grow on limestone soils. And quite a few different sites that you own, some of those being classified as Grosse Lager or Grand Cru vineyards. Tell me a little bit about the different sites at that top level for your GG wines and what characters you see in those wines.
So in general, we chose to limit our production to the very best vineyards. So all our vineyards are classified sites. So at the moment, the winery operates on 10 hectare Erste Lage and 8 hectare Grosse Lage, which is a very nice and lucky position to be in, to work on such a big area of very good vineyards. Of those 8 hectare Grosse Lage, we work on 4 sites for Riesling. The Meerspinne, which is here in Gimmeldingen, has a bit more Löss influence and is a very cold vineyard, and so it's one of our leanest Rieslings. Vogelsang is our newest addition, something that we are very excited about because it's a very steep vineyard, it's very high in altitude, and it's shell limestone soil. So it's limestone again, so we thought it fits to us, but it's a little bit different expression. And so it's a very elegant and playful wine. And then we come to Königsbach, where we have 5 hectare in general. And Königsbach is our heart, so it's the next village. In Königsbach, we have the Ideg, which is the core vineyard for our winery and for our family. It grows on the tertiary limestone soil, and somehow the Ideg is always in balance. It's nice because it gives us great grapes, but it's also very easy to work in. In every complicated year, when we go to the Edek, the grapes look nice, they taste nice. It's a vineyard that makes our life also very easy. And the wines from the Edek, they always have a very nice balance and long structure to them. It's also wine that needs some aging. And then we also have the Ölberg, which is also in Königsbach. It lies above the Edek, a bit closer to the forest. So it's a little, I'd say it's the colder brother of the Edek. Somehow.
Yes, beautiful sites, beautiful wines. And when it comes to expressing those vineyards, obviously you would say that you don't do much in terms of the cellar because the grapes that you're getting in are so beautiful. But at the same time, there are choices that you're making in order to let the vineyard express itself. What are those choices, generally speaking, when it comes to Riesling? What do you do when you receive those grapes to try and make sure that the site is expressed as purely as possible?
I think something that I just talked about with my father yesterday, that in our opinion, it's the most complicated thing about winemaking is making all those decisions under circumstances that are not ideal, because working with nature is never ideal. So I think every winemaker has an idea how to make a perfect Riesling under perfect conditions. But usually working with the weather is never perfect. It's either too warm or too cold or too wet. And so I think one of our main takeaways from the last years is that we need a very big picking team. So we pick all our grapes by hand, and we have a team of roughly 40 pickers to be very quick, because we need to be able to pick the vineyard on the perfect day, or on the most perfect day that we can get, depending on the weather. And so the timing of the picking is something that is really crucial for us, for our style of wine, because we neither want the grapes to be unripe, but we also don't want them to be overripe. I think it's just like any fruit. With the banana, everyone has a very clear picture in mind how a banana should look, that it tastes nice. It's not nice when it's green, it's not nice when it's brown. And it's just the same for grape. And if you're 2 days too late and you get the brown banana, it doesn't give you a great wine. And apart from that, we try not to intervene, but to shape the wine. And I think the main things for us are spontaneous fermentation. So the winery has been certified organic and biodynamic for more than 20 years, so I don't know it in any other way. And the work with those old oak barrels. So all our single vineyard Rieslings ferment in oak, but the barrels are not classic barrique, but big Doppelstück, as we call it, so like a double pièce. and they are between 2.5 and 4,000 liters in size. So it's very big barrels, and they are old. So when we get a new barrel, we wait a few years before we put in Riesling for the first time. Because we don't want the wines to taste oaky, but we only want the barrel to allow some oxygen to shape the wine during the fermentation. And I think apart from that, we don't do a lot.
Do you ever allow the berries to soak in the juice before fermentation?
No, not anymore.
Right. And the juices, when they go to the barrels, are you very careful to have clear juices, or are you happy to run them when they're still settling?
So I think the last time where we had some skin contact on a Riesling was maybe like 15 years ago or something like that. But we also don't press whole bunches. So that's maybe like interesting information, because we believe that the juice needs a short contact to skin and stems to give some structure. And so we crush the grapes into the press, and then the grapes sit in the press until the press is full. So the first grapes that get in have a skin contact of maybe 2.5 or 3 hours. The last grapes don't have any. And so we have maybe an average skin contact of an hour or so. And then we press. We don't think longer skin contact makes any sense for us with the vintages that we've seen in the last years, because Riesling is defined by its acidity in the end. And if we have too much skin contact, we lose too much of the acidity. And therefore, it doesn't make a lot of sense in our perspective. And then we press into a stainless steel tank, mostly to see how many liters we have pressed from a parcel to decide which barrel fits the amount of wine. But in this tank, we chill the juice a bit, and then we rack it into the cellar on the next day. But we have very cloudy juice. So we only leave maybe 2 or 3 hands of settlements on the bottom of the tank. Apart from that, all the like fruit flesh and everything goes in the fermentation, because it helps the yeast to have a more lively fermentation that is also more likely to ferment to a dry wine, which is important for us. And we also believe that the cloudier juice makes a wine that has a bit more structure in the end somehow.
Very good.
Yeah.
And typically, Sophie, how long do you like to wait? I mean, it probably depends on the vintage and the vineyard, I'm sure, but how long do you like to wait before you start to drink your Rieslings from the various vineyards? And also, how do they tend to progress with time in the bottle?
Usually when we have just bottled the wine, we are curious to taste how it has turned out. And so we usually open a bottle right away. And I think usually Riesling drinks quite well within the first 1.5 years, when it's still quite fresh and fruity. But for the GGs, I'd always recommend to store them like maybe 4 or 5 years, because they go through a period where they somehow don't know whether they are young or aged. And usually after that time, they come out a bit changed. So the acidity drops back, and the wine opens up. And I think from 5 years age, a Riesling can be drank for another 20 or so. And I think it's really one of the main things that people sometimes forget about Riesling, that it ages so beautifully, and that it really makes sense to store it a little bit before you open everything that you bought. So I usually recommend to buy a case of 6, so you can taste the progression of the wine.
Yes, and I'm going to ask a question that I think perhaps annoys you, but it is quite interesting that people still ask, and they're quite interested in this. And that is, obviously, when you were over in Australia in 2016, you were working with one of the pioneers of screw cap bottling here in Australia. And I know the way that you think, and the way that your very good friends like Cornelius and Philip think, that you are not making a quick decision about things like what closures you use. Obviously, you're producing the best possible grapes that you can, the best possible wines, and you're always thinking about the best way to present them. What do you choose as your closure, and why?
I think a closure is a very individual decision, but you're right, it's something that winemakers discuss a lot. So we always use natural corks. We have bottled trials with Diam up from 2012, and we chose to switch to Diam corks in 2021. So now all our wines are closed with Diam, and for us, it's the perfect closure, because it allows the oxidation that we know from a natural cork, and that's always something that we miss on a skew crab. For us, and I think for our style of wines, we need a bit more oxygen for the development. But the diam allows us to have a wine that doesn't have any cork flavors and that also gets the exact amount of oxygen that we want. Because I think the main challenge with natural cork, of course, is that it's a natural product, and so they are very diverse. And I think the worst thing is not even a bottle that's corky, it's something that you easily realize, but a bottle that maybe tastes 15 years older than it should. And so at the moment, we are super happy with the diam corks.
Excellent. Now let's move on. Talking about evolution, Pinot Noir has undergone an unbelievable change in Germany. I think one of the most surprising graphs that I show people when talking about German wine is what proportion of the vineyard was planted to Pinot Noir back in the 90s compared to now. And that is shooting up really quite fast. In some ways, I suppose there were growing pains for Pinot Noir stylistically and also perhaps where it was planted, where it was going to go in Germany. Nowadays, there's no doubt that the best growers in Germany have really mastered where they grow it and how they grow it. And your name always crops up. In fact, not just the Christmann estate, no disrespect to your father, Steffen, but really this is generally seen as being the Sophie revolution when it comes to Pinot Noir. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about, first of all, not your journey with Pinot Noir, but in Germany, like how have you seen that change over your lifetime, the importance of this grape variety and the quality?
So I think we need to look before my lifetime. As we said before, the Pinot wines arrived here hundreds of years ago. So there's a very long history. And we also, we have a very old French wine book. It's called Tous les vignobles connus. So it describes all vineyards that were part of France in 1815. And since we were part of France back then, it also describes the Mittelhaardt region. And it says that in the area here, there doesn't grow any good red wine apart from the village of Königsbach, which is the place where the edict is. Mm-hmm. And so we know that there has been high quality growing of Pinot already 200 years ago. But I think maybe between the 50s and 90s, apart from some pioneers, the Germans didn't really understand Pinot correctly. They thought Pinot is a red wine and they wanted to make a heavy, oaky red wine, which Pinot just isn't. And so it took us a while as a country, I think, to really understand what makes a Pinot great and how we have to handle it to make it a great wine. And I think this process started in some pioneering estates like Huber or Fürst quite a while ago, but only in the last 10 years maybe we get the movement really going for German Pinot. The climate here is maybe a little bit like Burgundy in the 90s. As I said, we have great limestone soils, so the soils also shouldn't be the problem. I think the main problem for Germany was that we needed to work on our knowledge, how to handle the grape, how to make a nice wine from a Pinot Noir grape. And I think this was a process, but I think now we have gotten quite close.
Yes, I mean, there's a fairly classic phrase about how people often start with the kind of Pinot they want to make before they realise that they have to make the kind of Pinot their vineyard wants to make. And I suppose that's a little bit of that learning curve. Now, as you said, Huber is one of the pioneers there down in Baden. You did a vintage, I think, with Julian Huber, did you not?
Yes, also in 2016. So I did 2 vintages in that year, and I did the harvest in September there in 2016, which was a great experience because it was the last vintage that I did in another estate before I started working here. And so I was already educated enough to understand very well what was happening. I think in my first vintage, I was mostly surviving. But at Huber, I really had a chance to see a winery that is focused on Pinot grapes in the same way as we are focused on Riesling. Everything was about Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And it was a super interesting experience for me.
Okay, so what did you bring back to Pfalz and how have you adapted your learning over time to the Pinot Noir that you're growing there?
So I think I can't pick out like a single thing that I brought back because I just learned how to treat a Pinot grape between picking and putting it in barrique and all the steps in between, which is something that we didn't have lots of experience with. I think, as everyone knows, my father was part of the Riesling generation with Philipp and Hans-Jörg Repolz. They were the generation that really wanted to make German Riesling known again. They wanted to make people realize the great history of our vineyards and everything. And so our winery was focused on Riesling. We had a bit of Pinot Noir, but we also had a bit of Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, other varieties. They were never really important. And so it was also my father that was very eager to develop more quality in the Pinot Noir, because I think everyone that knows us knows that we are also very structured people. So we don't do anything without a plan. And when I had decided that I wanted to join the estate, we sat down and we discussed what we wanted to focus on and what we wanted to do in the next years, because like when I came home, I was only 24, he was in his early 50s. So we knew we'd be working together for quite a while. And so we thought we needed a 10-year plan of what we wanted to do. And so we looked at the winery and we discussed about the things that are like working well and the things that are working maybe not so good. And we had the impression that we have a great potential for Pinot Noir here, like limestone soil, perfect climate. So we thought it must be due to our knowledge if we can't make great Pinot. And that's why I chose to go to Julian, because in the end, I also believe in not going too far away if you really want to learn something that you can apply in your own winery. And I think this was the start of our Pinot journey. So I think in the end, if I would have been alone without my father, I would have been way slower, because I wouldn't have dared to change everything from one year to another, because like after the 16 harvest with Julian, in the 17 harvest here in the winery, we changed everything for Pinot. So we bought tanks, we bought a new press, we bought barrels. This was really a fresh start for us.
Over that time, how have the plantings changed? Have you planted more in new areas, and what percentage of the vineyard is it now?
So when I came to the estate, we had almost 80% Riesling. Now it's dropped to 70%. And apart from one parcel of Pinot Blanc, everything else is Pinot Noir. So we have almost 30% of Pinot Noir. We have been quite lucky to get some nice parcels in vineyards we had already been working in. So we were able to increase the plantings in some vineyards. But we have also planted some new parcels with Pinot. At the moment, we also think that we will increase the Pinot a little bit more. So maybe in a few years, we will only have 65% of Riesling, just because we think that Pinot works so well and it's so much fun to make it. In general, we have, of course, planted the Pinot mostly on the limestone soils. So while Riesling also grows very well on sandstone, it just gives another character. With Pinot, I think it's more complex because it doesn't grow so well on a sandstone soil, in my opinion.
And how about the ripening time, Riesling versus Pinot around your sites?
So usually the Pinot is ripe, I'd say maybe like 10 days before the Riesling. So some vineyards even earlier, because of course it's funny that we always only talk about genetics when we talk about Pinot. I think no one has ever asked me for the genetic of a Riesling vineyard. But with the Pinots, we have those old plantings of German clones from the 70s and 80s that were luckily planted before Germany got in those very high volume clones. And so we have those plantings, but the vineyards that we have planted in the last years are mostly Selection Marcel from Burgundy, and they have very little grapes and they yield very low. And so when those vineyards are young, they get ripe very, very early, which is sometimes a little bit of a challenge to be back from summer holidays in time for picking.
Okay, we talked a bit about your approach with Riesling in the winery, how you handled that grape variety. How do those decisions stack up when it comes to Pinot Noir? What do you do to, again, try and preserve the character of the fruit and the vineyard?
I think the main idea is pretty much the same as with Riesling. So our goal is to make a wine that is elegant and playful, but also structured and long and never too heavy. I think that's the main goal for both varieties. For Pinot, this means also not picking too late. I think there's nothing worse than picking a Pinot too late because you get those jammy flavors. And so we have a good picking date, and then we crush the grapes into the tank. We use some whole bunches, but never too many. So I think the highest amount that we've had was 20%. in a very warm year. So in a cold year, we'd have only maybe 5 or 10%. In a warm year, it's a bit more. Something that we do different than others is that we make a decision for the amount of whole bunches for the whole vintage, because it's our main goal to make the terroir speak in the wine. And so I don't want to influence it with our choices. So we handle all vineyards the same. And when the grapes are in tank, we have a short cold maceration. And then during the fermentation, we do lots of remontage, and only remontage by gravity. So we don't have too much pressure on the wine. And we do very little pigeage, because I don't want to get out too many tannins, especially with the stems in the fermentation. And then I also like to press very early. So usually we press after 14 days after picking. And then we go back in tank and allow the wine to settle down a bit, because we also don't want to go too cloudy into the barrels, because I don't want the wines to turn out too reductive in the end.
What kind of wood are you aging those wines in?
So while the Rieslings all age in oak from the Palatine forest, in barrels that are built in the next village, the Pinots all age in barricks from Burgundy. We believe that we need to specialize in the things that we can do best. And so we also want to buy from the people that specialize in the things they can do best. And I think the barrels from Burgundy are just the best for Pinot. I try to buy barrels that will shape the wine, but that won't influence the wine too much. So many of the barrels, for example, François Frère is a tonnellerie that gets talked about a lot. I think they are too strong for our style of wine. Very often for me, they are too loud in the end. So I prefer, for example, Taranceau or Chassin, because in my opinion, they give a lot of structure, but they don't flavor the wine in the end.
This is a bit of a tricky question because it involves, again, a bit of a generalization. But when it comes to the, say, Austinlagen, the wine that comes from the vineyards around, the estate's calling card Pinot Noir, how would you describe roughly, again, vintage to vintage is going to change, of course, roughly the kind of fruit spectrum and the weight and the acid profile and the structural profile of those wines?
So I'd say we are known for a little bit lighter style of Pinot, because like I said, we are one of the most southern Riesling growing areas, but we are rather a little bit northern Pinot growing area, because lots of Pinot in Germany grows in Baden. And so our Pinots are maybe a little bit more elegant, a little bit lighter. So also if you look at the fruit, of course it's very berry driven, but I'd say our Pinots have a bit more, they have rather cherry than raspberry, I'd say. I'd also say that the wines, they have a long structure and body, but they are not very heavy. They are very elegant and playful, and I also want the acidity to be present. So of course they shouldn't be acidic, but the acidity should be present, and you should realize the acidity as some sort of freshness in the wine, I'd say.
Yes, and you mentioned that all of your sites are classified sites, so Erste Lagen and Grosse Lagen, Premier Cru and Grand Cru, as we have it in French. The vineyards that you're using for Pinot, I mean, Idich, quite remarkably really for a vineyard, I guess, is a Grand Cru that is a Grand Cru for Riesling and for Pinot Noir, and in both those grape varieties, again, not really a common thing among other Grand Cru vineyards around the world, manages to make a wine that's very much worthy of that Grand Cru classification every year. Just give us an idea of the characters that you see potentially in the Idich wine and maybe another vineyard or two that you're making single vineyard Pinot Noir from.
I think the nice thing is that we make Riesling and Pinot as well in the Vogelsang as in the Idich. So in our two most important GEG sites, we have both varieties, and it gives you a bit better understanding of terroir, I think, in the end, if you can taste it in different varieties. And in the end, the Idich Riesling, just as the Idich Pinot, is always a bit more in balance. So also the Idich Pinot is a very gentle wine. It's very much in harmony with itself, I think. And the Vogelsang, if you compare it, as I said before, the Vogelsang is a bit more dramatic as a vineyard, because it's steeper, it's higher in elevation. And so the Vogelsang as a wine is also maybe a little bit more energetic somehow. It's not as calm. It's a wine that asks a bit more concentration from the people who drink it, maybe. But in general, I'd say it's something that what we've learned in the past 8 years in which I have been responsible for the Pinots here, is that you can taste the terroir pretty much in the same way as you can taste in the Riesling, which is very nice.
Yes, it's very cool. And the Idich, it's funny with the Riesling from Idich because people always seem to notice its remarkable delicacy at the same time as its remarkable power, really. And I suppose that's the real beauty, that contradiction that site has, because it is both of those things at once. And you would think normally when you heard someone talking about delicacy and power that they were talking about two different wines, but it seems to be something that it does with an effortless kind of balance. Now, before we move on, I just wondered if there are any, when it comes to Riesling and Pinot Noir, you've mentioned obviously Jeff Grosset and Steph, and also for Pinot, your time with Julian Huber. Are there any other people whose wines that you've been looking at recently, maybe from Germany or from somewhere else, who impress you and motivate you when it comes to Pinot Noir or Riesling? Maybe they're making even a different grape variety that you find inspiring you to find new things in your own wines.
I think in the end, the nice thing about German winemakers, and especially the winemakers in Pfalz, is that we are all friends with each other. And so I think one of the main things when I think about other winemakers is the discussions and tastings that we have together. So for example, we always meet in spring with Rings, Böcklin Wolf and Rebholz to taste our young Rieslings before they get bottled, which is a very vulnerable time because we present our first draft of a wine in the end. And this is one of the most important tastings for us because it gives us an idea of how our wines will taste within other wines in the vintage. And we also get feedback from people that know our wines every year, every parcel, everything. And I think, especially with Riesling, but now I think also with Pinot, it's not so much about looking up to someone and trying to recreate something. It's mostly meeting and discussing where we want to go with German Riesling, where do we want to go with German Pinot, what should be the style. Of course, we also taste wines from Burgundy. We drink a lot of wines from Burgundy. But in the end, we need to define a German style of Pinot. I think that's something that is very important to me. Very often have people tasting the Pinots and they go like, this is just like Chambol, and this one is a bit more like Wohn. And I go like, yeah, but that's Gimmelding and Königsbach. And we are actually quite proud of those villages. And so I think in the end, we live in a time now where we are a group of young growers that have lots of ambition for their wines. And we want to shape the idea of a German Riesling and a German Pinot in the future. And that's something that we discuss about a lot. Mostly with wineries from Pfalz, I'd say.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned when you started at the States in 2016, how you sat down with your father and you're very structured people and you made a plan. What wasn't in that plan at that time was making the most ambitious German sparkling wine possible. And that's something that's come up as a bit of a surprise. But it seemed to me when we were first speaking about the project that you took on, that it was just too good an opportunity. The fruit was there. You had a very, very talented winemaker who was looking for something to do. And you just thought, well, this is a challenge that is just too good to say no to. Tell us a little bit about your sparkling project.
Yeah, so we had just sat down and decided that we wanted to make the winery a little bit smaller to focus on the best vineyards and the most important grapes and things like that. And then one day in summer 2019, our neighbor popped over and asked whether we wanted to take over his 12 hectares of vineyards. And it's something that we, not in our wildest dreams, we could have imagined this happening, because I think with many neighbors, relationships can be complicated. And so this was a big surprise for us, and of course didn't fit into our plan. But on the other hand, it's been a very old family winery with very nice vineyards here in the village. So it was too good of an opportunity to just say no to those vineyards. And pretty much in the same time, Mathieu Kaufmann, who's been the chef de cave of Bollinger until 2013, he had come to Germany after to work at Reichsrat von Buhl. and he had just left the estate. So he was looking for something new, and we had those vineyards and we didn't really know what to do with them. So I think at some point, drinking the maybe second or third bottle of wine, my father said, Mathieu, why don't you think of something? And a few minutes later, Mathieu said, why don't we make sparkling? And that's pretty much how it started. And we actually started picking roughly 2 weeks later to pick the first grapes for a new estate in which we only wanted to make sparkling wine. So I think now we have outgrown the project because we have roughly 400,000 bottles of sparkling wine aging in cellars now. So it has really grown into a real estate, and it's very exciting. Because I think when we look at German sparkling, Germans have mostly made sparkling wine from a rather technical point of view, I'd say. There's lots of German sparkling wine, but lots of German sparkling wine goes to supermarkets on a very low price level, and it is not even made from German grapes. And we were really jealous about the grower movement that we saw in Champagne, with very individual sparkling wines from different parcels. And of course, as winemakers, we have made single vineyard wines forever. It's just what we do. And so, of course, we were very curious to make sparkling wines that are also vineyard driven. And I think this was the main motivation to start to make sparkling wine in the end.
Okay, so as you said, it has developed into a proper estate. I mean, it has its own name. It's the Weingut Christmann and Kaufmann, and a project. I mean, everyone always talks with sparkling about how long it takes to establish a sparkling program, and not just that. I mean, even the first release, when you're looking to age on lease and also eventually build up those reserves. Tell us a little bit about how it's developed and what you are actually bottling under what cuvée names, etc.
So we are heading into our 8th vintage already. So when we sat down and we had decided that we want to make sparkling wine, but everything else was up for discussion. So we decided that, of course, we wanted to make single vineyard sparkling, and we also wanted to build an estate that allows us in a very independent and handcrafted way. So, for example, all our sparklings are brut nature. We never add any dosage. So it's very dry sparklings. So of course we knew we wanted to make single vineyard sparklings. But when you make single vineyards, you also always have parcels that don't really fit in. And so we chose to set up a structure where we make 2 different cuvées. So we make a cuvée that is blended together from different Riesling parcels and a cuvée that is blended together from different Pinot variety parcels, which includes Pinot Noir, Pinot Blanc, and Chardonnay. And so we make those 2 cuvées that age on lease roughly for 3 years. And above that, we bottle 6 different single vineyard sparklings, some made of Riesling, some made of Chardonnay. There's also a new rosé made of Pinot Blanc. But those wines are really shaped by the terroir that they grow in.
And you say zéro dosage for all of the cuvées. You're talking about a lot of single vineyard wines, and then also, of course, the viticulture is everything at Christmann, and the fact that you have that grape quality. But what do you do in the growing and the making of those wines to achieve the balance that you're after? What's the process?
So I think in the end, it mostly needs time. So I think one of the things that we make different than what we have learned at university about making sparkling wine is that we believe that also for a great sparkling wine, you need an old vineyard, low yields, so you get grapes that really have taste and structure, especially because you pick earlier for sparkling than for still wine at quite low yield, so that with the early picking, you still get a nice flavor in the berries. And so we are really happy to be able to work on very old sites with quite low yields. Then when we've picked all the base wines, also ferment spontaneously in oak. We use barrels that are a little bit smaller than the barrels that we use for a Riesling still wine because we want to have a little bit more oxidation. And all the wines make a malolactic fermentation in barrel, and we don't use any sulfates. So the sparklings usually don't have any sulfates in the end. And I think that's something that is very important for sparkling wine because the bubbles, they keep the wine fresh. And so if the base wine is too fresh and too lean, the sparkling won't be pleasant to drink. And so we need the generosity of the fermentation in the oak barrel and the malolactic fermentation to give the wine the structure and the softness somehow so that it makes a balanced sparkling in the end.
Now, even with all this work going on, it seems to me that your father always looks more relaxed every time I see him, despite the ambitions of the estate. Maybe that's because he knows that his daughter's got everything under control. But what would you tell us about Mathieu's temperament? What's he like as a person, and what have you learned from watching how he operates?
Mathieu is a very quiet person, and it's something that we needed to learn because my father and me are, I wouldn't say we are super talkative, but in the end, if a room is quiet, someone of us will start talking. And we had to learn with Mathieu that we always need to count to 10 before he will start talking. Because if we start talking too early, Mathieu will just not talk. But it's so interesting to listen to him. For me, it's super impressive, especially when we taste all our barrels and decide on the blends for the cuvées, to know how a base wine should taste, that it will turn into a great sparkling wine. I think now, after doing this for almost a decade, we have gotten some ideas and we have learned something, but still it's very impressive to me to have that picture in mind, how a wine will turn out. And another thing that I find very impressive is that, like, of course, we bottle all sparkling wines ourselves. And so we have like the base wines, and then we add the yeast and the sugar for fermentation, and then we bottle. And that's a very sensible process, because if the bottles don't ferment, you will have a sweet still wine in a sparkling wine bottle, which is not very easy to sell. And so this is a process that needs to be very precise. And so when we know we'll bottle sparkling, then Mathieu will be here like 10 days before that to start the yeast. And then the yeast will be checked every few hours, and he will count all cells through the microscope to be really sure that the yeasts are like strong enough to survive the fermentation, as he says, in the bottle, and to build up the pressure so that the sparkling wines really ferment to be dry. So it's a very handcrafted process that I didn't know in that amount before, which is super fascinating.
It is super fascinating. And so you have the vinification, obviously, of your wines in your winery there. Are you using the facilities at the winery from the vineyards from your neighbour for the sparkling program?
Yeah. Like, they are just on the other side of the road. And so we are still using their cellar. We have replaced all barrels because they were not that fresh anymore. But we also believe in barrels being the best place for fermentation for sparkling wine. And so we bought lots of new barrels. Apart from that, we also use lots of infrastructure from the winery, because we talked about sparkling wine being a very long-term project. And so it's also financially a very long-term project. And if we wouldn't have been able to use lots of infrastructure from the winery, things like labeling machines, forklifts, things like that, we'd never have been able to afford to age the sparklings so long. Because we have like a minimum aging of 3 years. The single vineyards age for 5 to 8 years. So that's lots of money aging in our cellar also. And therefore we chose to set up the things for the sparklings that we need to make the best possible quality for sparkling wine. But everything else that we wanted to invest was invested in the time, and the time of aging mostly.
It is an amazing project. The wines literally look absolutely fabulous. The packaging, I think, for all the Christmann wines, but also the Christmann A. Kaufmann sparkling wines, super elegant, and what's inside the bottle also super expressive, very elegant wines, very impressive. Those who have tasted them here in Australia have been blown away by them. How's the reception been where you've shown them around in Europe and elsewhere?
I think especially in Germany, people were super excited by this collaboration of Mathieu being a little bit like, Mathieu's almost like a legend for sparkling wine in Germany, because he was the first person coming from outside, like imagining someone coming from Champagne to Germany to make sparkling wine. And so people were super excited about that, which was great for us, because so many people have been like cheering from the first day on, waiting for the first bottles of sparkling. And so it's going very well. And we are very, very happy that we are now slowly coming. So at the beginning, the challenge was mostly that the quantities were so scarce that I think we also disappointed some people. But now the estate's almost in full swing. And so I think now everything's finding its balance, which is very nice.
Excellent. Well, I hope it continues to go from strength to strength. I think it's a hugely ambitious and brilliant project. Speaking of finding balance, how is your relationship with your father? It's not always easy working with those closest to you, but how do you work together? What do you bring? What does he bring? How do you make sure that you don't annoy each other too much?
I think in the end, the amazing thing is that we really enjoy working together. And it's something that I would wish everyone that goes into a winery is to have someone that you have really good relationship with. I know it's complicated for so many families, but for us, it's always been quite easy, actually. I think we are good at talking. Of course, we have gotten better. I think in the first 1 or 2 years, it took us some time to figure out some things, how we handle things differently. But I think we both really appreciate what the other's been doing and adding to the estate, and also how the other works. And so, like, of course, sometimes we annoy each other, but I think everyone that works together sometimes is also annoyed by the other persons. But in the end, I think it works really great. And I think also looking back, so I have joined the estate almost 10 years ago. I think we have changed so much more than we thought, and also so much more than one of us alone would have changed. And I think that's really the amazing thing that I try to explain other winemakers. And also, like, of course, sometimes the old generation doesn't want to let go, but I think also sometimes the young generation doesn't really appreciate and listens to the older generation. And for me, my father was also giving me lots of security in the end. Because, for example, with the Pinots, in the beginning, we were only spending money on plantings, barrels, tanks, a press. So I think I wouldn't have never dared to spend so much money on something like that. But he always said, like, we'll keep going, we believe in that, and we can afford that. So looking back, he was one of the big factors why we changed the quality of our Pinot so quickly. I think alone I would have been way slower, which would have been a pity and also a missed opportunity. The funny thing is that at the beginning, when I wanted to join I had finished my studies, I had worked in other estates, I was ready to come home. And at the beginning, he said to me, I'm 52, I'm actually, like, it's going quite well for me. I don't really need any help. And it was Philip Wittmann, who back then said to him, "Let Sophie come home. It will be nice," because Philip has been working together with his father also for a very long time.
Yeah.
So my father still calls Philip's father when he wants to talk about vineyard works and decisions for the vineyards. And so it's so at the moment I hope he'll never retire.
And do you enjoy traveling to talk about the wines and going into the trade and explaining what you do?
I think up to a certain amount, yes. So I think in general, the life of a winemaker, if managed well, it's a great life. But it's also an opportunity that you can, like, adjust the estate a little bit to how you want your life to be. I think in the end, I want to be a winemaker. I don't want to be like a salesperson. So I really want to be with the vineyards. I want to be here to make all the decisions to really, like, work with my feet on the ground. But on the other hand, it's also a great opportunity to travel sometimes to show the wines. And it's also a great part of the motivation that we get, I think, is that you travel to a place like Australia, like Thailand, to places that are quite far away, and you meet people that are very excited about your wines. And that's something that is super special and super nice to experience. So I wouldn't want to swap with Ernie because I think he travels a little bit. He enjoys it, but for me, it would be too much travel. But I think it's about balance, and when we travel, I really enjoy it.
Yes, and although you love it there in Gimmeldingen, I kind of get the impression that when you do go on holiday, you guys like to be completely get away and get out to the wilderness. What does downtime look like? How do you relax?
I think for us, it's usually very boring. It's like traveling to a place where we can buy nice food. So this year we'll go to Denmark, to the coast, so we'll be able to buy nice fish. It's something that we miss sometimes in Pfalz because there's not really any coast nearby. And then it's mostly cooking, hiking, reading a book, drinking a bottle of wine. And in the end, we often end up discussing strategy for the winery.
Yes, but at least very far from social media and emails and that sort of thing. I'm sure you unwind very well when you're there.
We try our best.
Yeah, and so last question really, what is it about working in wine that has given you a fulfilling life? What motivates you and what do you want to do next with it?
I think in the end, it's a very individual decision, but I see so many people in my generation that are not really happy with what they do. And I'm so happy with our work here because I think it's a very unique opportunity to be able to work on the whole process of a product. Like we work in the vineyard and we plant the wine and we wake up at night and we look outside and wonder whether the thunderstorm will damage our grapes or whether we will have rain or whether it will be dry. And so we are very dependent by nature, and it's a very humbling experience, I think. And then on the other hand, it's also a quite creative thing, but it's also a very strategic thing to set up an operation that is able to pick a grape and make a great wine from it in the end. It's also lots of logistics that you need to be able to set up in the end. And then I also really like communicating about our wines. And maybe not in the sense of traveling everywhere, but in writing our newsletters, interacting with people on Instagram, or meeting people here in the winery to be able to see the fascination in people's eyes when you talk about the winery and the work and the process of making wine in the family estate. It's very rewarding. And so I think the great thing about that is the mix of all those things that we have to do, which is also, of course, something that makes the life of a winemaker more challenging year by year. At least that's my impression sometimes. We are not only agriculture anymore. We need to do many more things now, but that makes it very exciting. I think if we look into the next years, it will be very exciting years for us as a family because, of course, at some point, my father will want to slow down a little bit. We are switching houses now. So my husband and me will be moving in like the main house where everyone knocks on the door when there's a problem. And so I think this will maybe be our main project for the next years because we have made all the changes in the winery that we wanted to do in the last years. So I think maybe the next changes will be more on the personal family side, which is also exciting, I think.
Yeah. And then at the end of the day, I guess what gives you pleasure ends up giving other people pleasure with what you do. And that's a pretty cool thing to do.
Yeah, it is.
That's it for this week's alternative format edition of the podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack, that's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, and to my guest, Sophie Christmann. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.